What's going on, fellas? I was doing some coaching this morning, and a client of mine, Jake, reached out to me, and he said, "Hey Sam, I am doing a bit of a cut, and my work capacity in the gym, my performance in the gym, especially from an endurance perspective, has fallen off way more than I expected. Do you really think that this is just what the deficit is doing? It's not that steep of a deficit. This is a lot more than what I was expecting." And I thought this was a perfect segue for a video, because the things I've floated out there is things we could probably take a look at to see if they're making the cut worse for his training than it needs to be. The things I floated out there I feel are common mistakes people will make when they're trying to drop some body fat. If you watch my channel, presumably you are interested in strength and hypertrophy training specifically. So whether your goal is strength or size, cutting is something that most people will implement at various times, because you can't really bulk indefinitely, because eventually you reach such a high body fat that most likely your nutrient partitioning is poor. What does this mean? It means that once we're above a certain body fat, we can debate about what that body fat is excessively, whether it's different for enhanced natural athletes, whether it's even a real thing, because I have seen some very smart people push back on this idea, but functionally I've always found this to be quite useful. Once we get past a certain point of fatness, we are more likely to put on more fat than muscle, right? There's hormonal pathways that come with excess adiposity, right? So it's like, okay, even if our goal is strength, there are periods of time where we should probably be losing some weight. So that way we've got more room to bulk. We have better nutrient partitioning, so when we do introduce back in those calories, it's more likely to be added as muscle, right? So having some sort of periodization to your diet is important, regardless of whether your goal is performance or looks. So people will be cutting, and people will ask me about that. So I figured I would float these out there. It was just kind of a moment that came up in my coaching that I was like, yeah, man, this could be a good video, because I feel like these are the most common mistakes I see when people are going to cut weight. So when I was going, he sent me his diet, I looked over it, and I kind of identified three things that we can look at. The first one is when people want to get into a deficit, the first mistake they make is oftentimes they will drop their fat too low. I think fat is very much slept on as one, they're like, oh, that's the least important one, right? You got protein, that builds the muscles. Carbs, that's our fuel. What does fat do? Fat's bullshit. It just makes you fat, right? Like, people who don't have a formal education or haven't looked into kind of more educational resources on the internet, don't really have a grasp of what the importance of fat is. Oh, it's just extra calories that are the easiest to cut out. Well, no, right? We can survive without carbohydrates. You get into a ketogenic state, you could survive indefinitely like that. You cannot survive without protein, but you also cannot survive without fat. Some amount of fat is necessary for hormonal production. So the first issue we can run into by dropping our fat too low is more or less that you're going to crash your testosterone. If it goes low enough and you cut for a while on really low fat, you need a certain amount of fat spaced through your day to basically just feel good and energetic on any level. The number that you'll hear tossed around is maybe 0.35 grams per pound. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in kilograms. You'll probably have to look that up. Maybe 0.4 grams per pound as far as fat. As far as probably if you're fatter, you might be able to base that off of lean body mass. But it's going to vary from person to person. This is one of those things where you have to trial and error. Maybe you are someone who feels a little bit better going up to 0.5 grams per pound of body weight of fat. As long as they're healthy fat sources, you might find that you feel better and more energetic. Or you could be someone who's on the very low end. You want to intake the least amount of carbs you need for hormonal production, and any more just makes you feel groggy and whatever, right? So you need to kind of play around within these general ranges. But one of the most common issues I see is people just being like, okay, well, I'll just get this lean meat, and then I will not add any fat sources, and I won't have any peanut butter, and man, this is such an easy way to get my total calories down, just by nearly completely removing one of the three macronutrients and the one that has the highest caloric density, right? Carbs and protein are 4 calories per gram. Fat is way up at 9, right? So it's like it's on a gram for gram basis the most calorically dense, so it's easy calories to cut, and they'll kind of go a little too crazy with it. The other problem with cutting your fat right is protein and carbs comparatively digest relatively quickly. Fat, because of its greater nutritional density, more of a process of breaking it down, takes a longer time to digest. And the problem is that if you go really low fat, especially in your pre-workout meal, where people might go only protein and carbs, or maybe only carbs, is you're going to digest that very quickly. You're going to get a big blood glucose spike and crash, a big insulin spike and crash. Because we went through it, it all entered our bloodstream at once, and you might find yourself crashing halfway through the workout. And all you need to do to fix this is usually add maybe 10, 15 grams of fat to that pre-workout meal, and then suddenly it's a slow output of blood glucose because we're digesting it at a slower, more steady rate. This is something that I saw repeatedly mentioned by John Meadows. Back when I was first learning about nutrition, he was kind of the one guy who was very vocal about, hey, healthy fats are very important and should be included on a daily basis in your diet. One, back when people were kind of anti-fats, high carb, high protein approach, he's like, these are very necessary for health. And the other thing he would say is people are scared to include fat pre-workout because there was some old bro science of like, oh, well, when you go work out, you're going to shuttle an insulin response and the fat's going to be shuttled into our muscles or some crap like that, right? And it's like, realistically, we should be having some amount of fat, not so much that you're having to do a ton of digesting. Maybe it shouldn't be a big amount of fat or a big meal pre-workout, right? Because that's going to divert blood flow away from your muscles. But it's going to be enough that that pre-workout meal is a slow, steady release of blood glucose, insulin. That way we don't have a crash halfway through the workout. So mistake one, taking the fat too low for those two reasons. Mistake number two that I would see is, generally speaking, people will favor just cutting down on the amount of food to create a deficit rather than increasing their workload. Either works, it's a calories in, calories out equation, as we all know. But if you're watching my channel, you probably want to preserve your performance in the gym. And generally speaking, in my experience, the more food we can push through per day and still be in a deficit, the less our training is going to suffer. Could be because we're getting more micronutrients, even by having our maintenance be a higher amount of calories effectively. But the more food we can push through in a day, the better we're going to preserve our performance. So rather than creating a 200 calorie deficit via reduction in food, we might want to just introduce some form of cardio or increase our step count per day to create that deficit via activity rather than relying on reduction in food, which is probably going to hurt our performance in the gym worse. And even if hypertrophy is your only goal, preserving your performance in your gym is what's going to give your body the signal to hold on to your muscle while you're cutting down. If you can stave off getting weaker during your cut, it's a good sign that you're also staving off any significant amount of muscle loss, right? So the people who are like, yeah, you're just going to get weaker on your cut, you're cutting in such a way that it's probably indicating that you are losing some muscle on the way down. There is some science out there that says, oh, muscle loss is pretty negligible, but it's like we're also looking at people who aren't as far above their natural carrying capacity, their like general tendency as a semi-athletic person. There's an amount of muscle you carry. When they cut down, they don't go much below that, right? But if you get to people who are carrying more and more excessive amounts of muscles, like further kind of from that homeostatic state where they've had to bust ass for 5 years to carry all this muscle, the body kind of wants to return to that more efficient homeostatic state. My conjecture would be that they're more prone to losing muscle the more muscle you've built. So those of us who have been lifting for at least a bit, right? A lot of you watching this video, it might be something you have to be concerned about. So preserving your performance in the gym on the way down is a very important variable to look at, right? It's kind of a shift in bodybuilding that we've seen over the last couple of years is guys really trying to stay strong until that final 3 weeks out because that's their signal that they're not losing muscle on the way down and over dieting. And then the third one that I wanted to talk about is a little bit of a shift in approach that I don't really watch his videos because I don't think they're interesting, to be honest, but my understanding is that this is what Greg Doucette, who's kind of a very much only body fat focused, much less performance focused channel, which is why I don't think it's interesting. I'm not the target demographic, so absolutely fair. I think people kind of they misunderstand what's happening. They're like, Greg Doucette says you should main gain. Because yada, yada, yada. This is just scientifically unfounded because you're going to gain a lot more muscle in a surplus, blah, blah, blah. You have to realize that like his channel is so big, most of who he's talking to are people who are extremely casually into fitness and just trying to lose a little body fat. And I would say that if fitness is like your 10th most important goal or less in your life, and you're just trying to drop a little body fat, bulking up and well, let's say you're not trying to lose body fat, you're trying to look better. I think that going through dedicated bulking periods is not necessarily the best advice you could give someone who doesn't really have any performance-based goals. They're just trying to look a little bit better. They don't necessarily, by people who don't lift weight standards, need to gain very much muscle. They just need to lose some body fat. And I think that he knows that's his audience and tailors his advice towards this much more casual crowd, because there's only so many people who are good at something, or so many people who take something seriously. When a channel gets past a certain size, by definition, they're speaking more and more to the average person, the more really fringe people to this topic, right? So then you have to tailor it. I think he's a smart guy. He's aware that's who he's talking to. He's not talking to any of us who take lifting seriously. So that's why I'm a little like when people bash him in the fitness space, I'm like, I get it. There's some technically not so great advice here for us, but you have to really take a look at who he's talking to, right? When he's like, oh, a 225 bench in 5 years. Well, yeah, if you're talking to people who fitness is like number 15 priority in their life, yeah, it'll probably take them 15 years to bench 2 plates. That's not if someone was really applying themselves, and I think he said that's if they're applying themselves, but he doesn't want to trash his viewer and say, yeah, no, those people aren't applying themselves. He's aware of who he's talking to. But this does seem to be the approach he has, which is, hey, if we're trying to get into a deficit, we should switch to less calorically dense foods. That way we're able to eat the larger quantities that we're used to and still get less calories. So we're going to switch to things that are a little bit less calorically dense. And that would be his perspective. Now, from a performance perspective, from our perspective, I think that oftentimes this approach will lead you awry. Switching like, oh, well, I'll just eat egg whites instead of eggs, and I'll eat like low-calorie pancakes instead of whatever my morning carb was, and yada, yada, yada. We switch to these things that are pretty devoid of anything. They're a lot of volume, they taste decent, maybe they have some sugar-free sweeteners in them, that we can eat a lot of quantity and we can eat the amount we're used to, but then cut our calories down by 500 and lose weight. Awesome for the average person who doesn't care about the performance. The problem is most of these options that we might be looking to as less calorie dense foods are usually also less nutrient dense, going from an egg white from a whole egg, for example. And getting into a nutrition, like basically not consuming enough micronutrients has a very detrimental effect on our performance. Eating good, hearty, foods with high caloric density, but more importantly, high micronutrient density is basically just something you have to do as someone who's interested in getting bigger and stronger, right? So the approach I would take instead is I would take those same hearty, good foods. We're still eating some fruit. We're still eating our red meat. We're still eating our whole eggs. We're still having some avocados, right? Things like this that are high nutrient density foods. They're good foods. We decrease the quantity of these things, and because they're high caloric density, that quantity might get pretty small. It might be you have 1 or 2 eggs for breakfast. It might be you're only having a quarter of your avocado instead of the whole thing, right? But we decrease the quantities of these things and then use volumes of vegetables to kind of fill that extra space, which is also going to give us quite a bit more micronutrients, right? So we're kind of staving off the idea that we're going to get less micronutrients during a cut. We're going to get less macronutrients, but because we're filling up that volume with vegetables, which are quite low in calories and quite high in micronutrients, we're like, hey, we're going to get into a macro deficit. We're not going to get into a micro deficit by using that kind of as our filler rather than putting sugar-free syrup on low-calorie pancakes from Greg Doucette's cookbook. I have no idea what's in there. I'm just talking out of my ass. But usually this is going to be the better option for those of us who are interested in preserving our performance. You can select the vegetable on A, what you like, so you can eat it in those decent quantities, and B, what doesn't upset your stomach at all. Some things are high gas vegetables. Maybe you don't want to be filling up the rest of your stomach using broccoli because you're just going to be ripping ass for a couple of hours. Maybe instead you go with carrots, which are lower gas, like spinach, kale. It could be a wide variety of things. It could be snap peas. You have a whole lot of options, but this would be the approach I would take as far as how do I think about it is not like, hey, let's select low caloric density and eat a lot of volume of that. Let's eat a lower volume of those same good, dense foods, decrease that, and supplement the volume that we lost with vegetables to make sure that we're not coming up short on our macros. So I hope you guys like this video. This ran way longer than I thought it was going to. I thought this would be super quick, but I am pretty reasonably happy with all the points we touched on. I think that if you're someone who's interested in cutting, at least being introduced to these perspectives, I think is kind of important. So if you liked the video, please remember to leave a like. I believe it helps my channel. And thank you guys for 1K. It means a lot to me.